Aloha and welcome to the video. So this is part 2 of the stone slate knife. In this part of the video I'm going to be making the sheath. So for the sheath on this I'm going to be using koa wood. This is actually the same piece of koa that the handle material is made out of. So it should have a nice flow to it. Transition going from the handle to the blade. That first step there is just transcribing that V little design into the handle. I wanted to do that originally just because I thought that would look kind of cool to have a nice contoured transition from the handle material to the blade and also to the sheath as well. And so the first step here is I'm just kind of outlining kind of the overall shape of what that sheath is going to look like. I'm not going to cut it out first. I was kind of debating a lot as to if I was going to carve out the intersections of the sheath, which is what I've done before. What I ended up deciding to do is do a spacer. So if you watch people that make leather sheaths, you'll notice that they'll have two thick pieces of leather on either side and then a spacer that goes around the middle, and so the blade fits in between on that spacer. And so I'm going to be doing the same thing here. And so I've cut this piece of koa I cut it into four pieces, 4 sheets. 3 of the sheets were the exact same thickness. One of them ended up being a little bit thinner. Originally, I was going to use that thinner piece, but then when I was testing with it, I noticed that it was a little bit too thin. So at this stage here, I thought it was perfect. I was like, oh, perfect. It's a little bit tight, which means it'll have just a bit of a friction hold, but not too tight. And so I started working with that in mind. And so now that I have what I thought was going to be the final centerpiece, I went ahead and started designing out what I wanted it to look like. Now there's a lot of components to this sheath that I didn't pre-plan. So there's a lot of trial and error and just kind of trying to figure out what I liked, what I didn't like, what I thought would look good, what wouldn't look good, and move forward a little at a time like that. To cut these out, I taped them all together so that when I cut them out on the bandsaw, they stay together and I have a nice clean transition from each piece. That way they glue up better and there's less work to do when I go to start shaping. So the next step here is I gotta cut out the spacer. So there's 3 pieces here, and so I'm marking the inner edge on that spacer, or at least how close I want that inner edge to be. And then I can cut that out. And now that I have both sides plus a spacer, I can actually test the blade. But immediately I realized that the spacer was too thin. So I just used the spacer as a template, put that on that final sheet that I had, which is a little bit thicker, and that was a perfect fit. It's a little bit thicker than I wanted it to be, wider, so it didn't quite have that same friction hold that it did previously, but it had very little wiggle room, and so it's still a good solid hold. Not a friction hold, but tight enough that it would work for what I need it for. And I knew I was going to be sanding down a little bit on both of these. I'm just sanding down to 120 for the glue up, but I knew when I sanded it down it would compress it just a little bit more, which would make that fit just a little bit tighter, and so that would probably be perfect. Now before I glue it, I'm going to be pegging it. The primary reason for this is so that when I go to glue it, everything is perfectly held in the right spot. I was worried that when I go to glue it, it's going to slide around and I wouldn't get a nice good glue up, which has happened to me in the past. And so I put in these pegs to hold it into place while it glues. And that actually worked perfect. It probably added a little bit of structural strength to it, but I mean the glue is the primary structural hold. The pegs really kind of just kept everything in line. They did leave a little bit of a contrasting look to it, which was kind of cool. So, you know, I had a variety of use cases. As of this point in time, I wasn't entirely sure how the mechanical hold was going to work. I kind of had an idea. And so my original idea was I was going to have this first hole here that would have a lanyard and knotted on one side, and then a second hole here that was really close to the outside edge, so that part of the hole was exposed, just like that. And the mechanical hold would be you'd pull the lanyard around the outer edge of the blade where it wasn't sharp, and it would wrap around and lock into that groove. And I thought that was going to be great, and I was super excited because it's a mechanical hold. It's easy to fix if the lanyard breaks. It should be strong, easy to pull out, easy to put back in. So I thought it was going to look good, but as I was working on it and shaping it down and sanding it, I just didn't like the way it looked. And as I got to the point where I could kind of start to test it, it didn't work. There's way too much slack. I mean, especially because the lanyard itself isn't stretchy. It's a stiff material, and so it just didn't do what I wanted it to do. And so the conceptual idea kind of looked like it should work, but at the end it just wasn't. It maybe would work if I put that groove in the handle itself, and so the lanyard wrapped around the handle and pulled it down and locked it in. But all in all, I didn't like it. So you can see here I went ahead and made my lanyard. And it's the same material that I use when I lash teeth. I just did a twisted ply, and so it's a 4 twisted ply on the lanyard material. And as of this point in time, I was still working towards that original mechanical hold with the lanyard wrapping around and locking in place. But the entire time I was working on it, I just wasn't happy with it. I didn't like the way it looked. It just wasn't very strong. And so this entire time I've been thinking, like, what can I do? I already have holes drilled into the koa. Do I have to remake a whole new sheath? I don't want to use a different piece of koa because I like that this piece of koa matches the handle. Oiling it up is really beautiful koa, which I kind of expected just because it matched the handle materials. It came from the same piece. But it just wasn't holding tight. I didn't like the way that it looked. I didn't like the way that it felt. What I had envisioned in my mind just wasn't working out. And so what I ended up doing is I tried testing with it just a few more times, and after a while of just not liking it, I kind of just put it down and left, which sometimes you have to do. Sometimes you gotta step away and kind of rethink things through and decide what you're gonna do. And so what I had to decide is whether or not I was going to remake the sheath entirely, or if there's some way that I can change it and still use that piece of material. And as of this point in time, it was looking like I just needed to make a whole new sheath. And so I put it down and thought about it overnight, came back, and I actually came up with an idea that I felt really confident was going to work. And so the idea that I came up with at night, and as of this point in time, I hadn't quite thought up of that idea yet. I was just thinking of some conceptual thoughts. One of the ideas I had was, well, what if I peg it through the blade? That'd be a really strong mechanical hold. How do I make it so that the peg doesn't get lost? How do I, use this lanyard that I already have here? And so I was just thinking of different things. How do I fix this hole in the edge? And so I just wasn't sure. Well, that night I was thinking about it and I came up with an idea. And so the idea that I had is the first step is I'm going to peg it through the blade. So I drilled a 1/4 inch hole through that first section of the sheath. Using the tile bit, a 1/4 inch tile bit, I drilled a hole through the blade, put some water on there just so that the dust doesn't get up in the air. I drilled that hole, and then I finished. Once that was nice and true, I went ahead and matched that on the other side of the sheath. So now I have a pegged fit. Went ahead and made a peg, did the same trick that I did on the first peg where I used some sandpaper in my drill to make sure that the diameter of the peg fit perfectly with the knife. Once that was done, and I knew I had a good, nice peg fit, I'm going to go ahead and harden the peg. So that was one of my concerns before with using a peg, is if it gets wet, gets in the water, it's going to expand, and I didn't want it to get stuck. Either expand and not be able to put back in, or expand and get stuck inside of there. And so I fire hardened it, and then I'm going to lash the entire thing to a section of the lanyard, and so that's how it's going to hold in place. And then I'm going to oil it. And so the combination between the oiling and the fire hardening should seal it so that the peg doesn't expand too much. It stays relatively solid, and it'll hold right, my assumption is that it will hold a lot better. And so far it's actually perfect. Like the hardening, the fire hardening kind of helps it slide into place a little bit easier and locks down. And so from this point forward, I just kind of went with it. I decided to continue with this plan and keep going. So I'm going to lash the lanyard to the peg, just doing a basic lashing. You saw I drilled a hole into the peg, and so the lanyard feeds through the hole, wraps around, and then I lash around the peg and then around the lanyard to hold everything in place and make it really nice and strong. So that way it just stays on. And then with the pigtail at the end, I melted that down using my heat gun, and then cut off the excess of the peg. I still have it protruding just a little bit outside, just so that there's some meat for it to grab onto, but I didn't want it to stick out too far, because if it sticks out too far, it's too easy of a chance that it's going to bang against stuff and pop that peg out, which I didn't want to happen. So now I'm still left with that big gouge. And so what I had thought of in the middle of the night to do is I'm going to glue that into place, which I did. I let it sit overnight so the glue can harden. I mixed the glue with wood shavings, and that way it can harden. So it doesn't look good, but it fills that gap. So the gap is filled. It's nice and solid again. It's nice and strong. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to carve down into the handle material, so it on the top side, on the bottom side, there's a groove, a parallel groove from both sides, and then I'm gonna lash all the way around. And so the lashing, I figured would give a nice good contrast between the color of the koa, the color of the lash, plus it will match the color of the lanyard, so everything will have a nice contrasting look. It will mask the section on the sheath that I had to fix. So that little peg that's in place there, that wooden peg, it's going to cover that and completely effectively redesign my original design to look very different. And this actually worked out beautifully. I love the way that it ended up turning out. The lash that I'm doing on this is a very basic wrap, and then I have a loop on one side, and when I finish the wrap, I pull that loop tight with a knot, and everything kind of locks into place. And then I tuck the ends of the lash in underneath itself, so that way it's nice and clean and it looks really good. So the lash here is not a mechanical lash. It's not meant to hold anything in place. It's purely for aesthetics, but I think it looks awesome. I love the look of it. I think it gives it more of a Hawaiian look to it, Polynesian style look, which is a lot more my style anyway, and so that worked out beautifully. And I think it gave a nice contrast to the rest of the knife. So here is the finished piece, both the knife and the sheath. So the sheath is purely a protective sheath. It's not meant, you'll notice there's no belt loops or anything like that. I didn't want to put belt loops on the sheath because I was worried that any horizontal pressure of it being attached to your belt might break the stone. And so the sheath is just to protect the blade while the blade kind of hangs there. And so the lanyard at the back of the blade and the handle, that's a really strong, stout lanyard that's designed to, hook onto like a carabiner or a loop, so it just hangs. And then it's a friction hold for the peg, and because it's kind of just hanging there, the gravity of holding of the sheath is going to be more than enough tension for it just to stay in place. And so I love the way that this turned out. I love that the entire piece is mechanical, so it's easy to fix if you need to. The fire hardening on the peg turned out beautifully. It's that nice dark color, contrasts beautifully with the blade and the handle. The entire thing comes apart, so if anything needs to be fixed or replaced, it can be. Turned out to be a pretty awesome project. Well, let me know in the comments below if you like the way it looks, if you like how it turned out, if you think I should have done something different. I think it turned out awesome. I really love it. I am going to be putting it up for sale, so if you follow me on Instagram, send me a message there if you're interested in it. Mahalo nui for everyone that follows along and watches my videos. Thank you for all the support, and I will see you on the next video. I got a ton of stuff coming up. Aloha.